Hi everyone. This is my case study on the Bhopal disaster. It was a sad day in human history. It's the worst industrial accident on record, and it was a preventable one. I wanted to talk about how the disaster actually happened, the events leading up to the disaster, and then we'll talk about some of the lasting effects and the legal and political decisions that have been made since then. We'll close it with a reaction to the business response. This starts around the 1960s, mid 1960s, and there's an industrial revolution in India as well as the United States. The Indian government is running a campaign to promote international business, especially countries that want to outsource jobs and processes to India. They're saying that the Indian government's going to be there for those companies. They don't have to deal with heavy regulation and then the high barriers to enter the markets there. These favorable conditions were to raise the GDP in India, and they're just saying that they're going to have expedited processes for licensing, for the zoning approval, and they'll be less costly than running the processes in their home country. At this same time, there's a US based chemical processing company called Union Carbide that's looking to expand internationally. They're already well established in the US, and they discover these favorable conditions in India and decide to work with the Indian government to move over there. This is where a lot of the issues arise. We have two parties that have similar goals, just to increase revenues and raise their GDP. This kind of signifies a sacrifice for precaution, though. The Indian government acknowledging that the barriers are going to be a lot lower, standards are going to be a lot lower, and that can bleed over to the other side too, bleed over to the other party. It's a joint venture between the Indian government and Union Carbide. It's a U.S. corporation, and both sides want it to be profitable, and it pressures what causes, it's the root of a lot of the issues that happen. Uh, at the time of the disaster, there were 61 safety violations. Those were found in an internal audit conducted by Union Carbide. And of the 24 safety emergency shutoff systems that were supposed to be in place, the branch in India only had 8 at the time of the disaster. And half of those 8 were offline the night the disaster happened. So on December 3rd, the emergency shutoff systems failed completely, and it led to the mass dispersal of chemical gas. It's methyl isocarbonate, methyl isocyanate, MIC for short. Also released hydrogen cyanide and a lot of other toxic materials into the surrounding area in Bhopal. Led to the initial death toll of about 3,800 people, but this figure's been argued a bit. One source spoke to one of the truck drivers hauling away the bodies away from the site just in that first night, and by his estimations, the death toll would have been closer to 15,000 in that first night. Previously, there were 2 leaks of phosphine as one of the 2 ingredients that they were processing at the plant in India. It's phosphine and ethylamine. The first leak led to one death, one worker death, and then several people went to the hospital. The second incident, several workers died and many more went to the hospital, but these were about a year before the tragic event in Bhopal where 38 to 15,000 people died. And those numbers don't really touch on the true figure of victims, just the premature death and the adverse health effects that hundreds of thousands of people are dealing with today. A lot of these people are still seeking justice, say, both from the Indian government and from Union Carbide, the corporation. So these efforts did lead into a $470 million agreement, a settlement that Union Carbide agreed to. This went out to all the victims in Bhopal. I think the average payment was $2,000. Uh, the CEO, Warren Anderson, was arrested in Bhopal. He went there to damage control the event and see what could be done, or see what he could do personally. But they arrested him when he landed, and he made bail a few hours after, but he didn't return to India. Just a reflection on things that have happened since then. Pollution and toxic fumes are still a big issue in India. Industrial safety precautions are still a pretty big issue. There hasn't been a lot of change in policy to change this. There's been a recent rejection of a plea for additional support for the victims from the Indian government. The Supreme Court rejected that decision just earlier this year. There have also been no charges or extraditions. They weren't able to extradite the CEO Anderson before he passed away. But there have been no charges, no international charges to Unicorbide itself, and both sides still blame the other. Both parties still blame the other for the event. Unicorbide states that the event was the result of sabotage from someone at the India plant, and the Indian government blames Unicorbide wholly for the incident.